Welcome back to the Corner of Story and Game, where we dive into the world of storytelling and game design. Today I'm excited to have Gregory A. Wilson on the show. Gregory is a speculative fiction author, a podcaster, and a college professor known for his works such as The Third Sign, Icarus, and the Gray Assassin Trilogy. He's also the lead writer for Chosen Heart and co-hosts the acclaimed show Speculate. In today's episode, we're going to explore the arduous journey of taking a novel and turning it into a tabletop role-playing game. And we're going to discuss how Gregory's best-selling Gray Assassin Trilogy is making the leap from fiction to dice. We'll cover everything from writing craft to publishing, crowdfunding, and the challenges he's faced along the way. So, let's get at it. Gregory, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Gerald. I appreciate it.
I'm very excited to pick your brain today. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the work you've done, the novels you've written, the games you've been working on.
Okay.
But the real core of what we're going to talk about today is that journey of taking a novel into the tabletop role-playing world, because that's something you're experiencing or have experienced. Before we dig into it, though, I do like to set the stage with your origin story. How did you fall in love with writing, gaming? What was the journey to get from, a kid who loves the books to where you are today?
That's an involved question. The short version is that my father was an English professor, so I grew up sort of surrounded by books, so that was probably pretty likely to be where I was going to end up. And I loved, I always loved reading, and in particular, I was always drawn to works of fantasy and a lot of the standard ones, Lord of the Rings and things like that, but also ones that were a little probably way above my pay grade at the time, reading particular kinds of like fantastic Renaissance drama or, obscure medieval tales that I didn't know what the heck was going on when I was a kid with them, but they inspired me, and I was encouraged to kind of read more of those things. And it was probably because of that I not only enjoyed sort of the reading aspect, but then over time also became interested in gaming. And I grew up in the 80s, so I was right in the midst of Dungeons and Dragons and the Red Box, and the increase of interest in also, growing up as a Gen X or growing up in a very weird kind of bizarre time, which didn't even occur to me how bizarre it was until later, which had a lot of fantastical and strange movies like, Krull, and movies that's sort of the never-ending story, things that had this sort of darker edge underneath them that didn't really occur to me. Dark Crystal, another example. Things that I didn't think about really until later as having this kind of influence. But the result was that I found my sort of fantastic gaming interests and fantastic writing interest aligning a little bit more. And as computer games came in, and it was probably, mid-80s, 85, 86, 87, that I got like a TRS-80, and I did a little bit of programming on that. And then I got Nintendo and played a little bit of Legend of Zelda and stuff like that. And those things just started to interest me from a video game point of view. But at the same time, I had already been doing Dungeons and Dragons and running things for my friends and so on. And so in a way, they were kind of always a little bit united in my head, where I was reading extensively and I was also gaming quite a bit. But when I got into my professional life, I sort of didn't talk much about the gaming side for a while because I was worried that I was going to get labeled as like a dilettante, Yeah, I did some writing and some gaming, like I do a little bit of light writing type of thing. And I wanted to be taken seriously because I think I'm a good writer. I've worked hard at it, and I wanted that to be the sort of primary thing. And then I've just gotten a lot less insecure about it over the years, as a bunch of other people have done the same thing. And I've gotten into sort of gaming and writing. And so those things all kind of merged at some point in my adulthood where I could talk about them and sort of use them as professional things, not just as hobbies that I kept to myself. So that's basically the short answer.
That's a really cool story. I'm curious, were you a DM, a GM, or were you a player? Which role?
I was a DM. I mean, I got a chance to play a little bit later, but no, I was the forever DM kid, I started with my long suffering father, who I don't think knew what was going on with any of this, but he, put up with it, and I ran him through adventures such as they were and all that. And then, as I say, when I got a little older, I DM'd for my friends as well. But yeah, I was always kind of putting myself as the person who was putting the story together, who was building the world and running a lot of published stuff too. I did some homebrew stuff, but a lot more of it was sort of the classic modules of the 80s that I sort of linked together in my mind to other sort of larger campaign structures and adventures and things like that. And so, yeah, I always loved, I do enjoy playing too, but I've always loved the sort of DM, GM side of it, because being able to see people come together and have a good time and to see people doing collaborative work in storytelling is something which I really find engaging and interesting, both sort of personally and professionally. I find there's a lot of interesting things to be done in collaborative storytelling in games too.
So as somebody who loved games but was becoming a writer, did you read a lot of like the TSR Wizards of the Coast books or the Pathfinder books? Did you?
Yeah. Some of them I did for sure. I mean, a lot of the source books early on. I loved anything that had all of that kind of sidebar example text stuff. I really love that, being able to sort of see examples of the mechanics. And I always was like hoping they would do more of those sorts of things rather than just kind of like static stat blocks, and sort of the kind of read this text box thing I always thought was really cool. So yes, I definitely did that. And source books and also just instruction manuals. A lot of the games I played as a kid that were not D&D, board games like Talisman or the Fighting Fantasy game book series you might be familiar with, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson. I had 22, 23 of those. I loved those so much. And those were other things that I read that all sort of built this I don't know, contributed this zeitgeist, I guess, that I was drawing from in later on in my own work in terms of both tropes, but also ways that people could play with those tropes one way or the other. So yeah, I absolutely read source books, but also read other stuff that was tied into those other worlds, excuse me, that was tied into those other worlds that were part of it. So.
Okay. So to help us kind of set a base camp on this circular journey we're going to go on,
okay,
we're going to talk about the Gray Assassin Trilogy, because that's what's being turned into a tabletop role-playing game.
Yeah.
So let's start from base camp. Give me an overview. What is the Gray Assassin Trilogy? What inspired you to create this world, the characters?
Okay. So yeah, the Gray Assassin Trilogy is a work of dark fantasy with a lot of intrigue. The pitch line for the three books are Greyshade, Renegade, and Heretic. And the first book, Greyshade, the pitch line is, what if Jason Bourne were born in 15th century Venice, were trained in 15th century Venice, I should say, in the ways of sonic magic? And that premise of this man who is the best of the best, he is an elite assassin who kills in the name of his god. And fairly early on in the book, a mission goes off the rails a bit, and he ends up finding himself opposing the organization that he once served without question. And that's sort of the focus of Greyshade. Renegade takes him across country to sort of root out the level of conspiracy that has led to these things going wrong within the organization that he once served. And then Heretic allows him to kind of bring his, I don't know if I want to say vengeance, but brings his kind of his response to what has happened to him home to the headquarters of this organization, which is another major city that probably larger than his own home city of Corel. Corel, which is where Greyshade, the first book, takes place, is loosely modeled after Renaissance Venice. I did a lot of work. My doctoral work was in Renaissance drama, and so mostly English Renaissance drama, but I also was interested in certain Renaissance cities, things like Constantinople, but in particular Venice, for a number of reasons, and so this was loosely modeled after that. And the inspiration for the books themselves, the original inspiration was an old TV show called The Equalizer. There's now obviously a modern Equalizer. There's also movies with Denzel Washington, but I watched the original 80s series with Edward Woodward, and I always loved the concept of a person who has this massive organization with resources and all that stuff arrayed against a person who can counterbalance it because he knows exactly how that organization works and why. And so that is the sort of kind of mechanics of it. Thematically, I'm interested in the question of faith and redemption and whether those things are possible for a character like this, whether he should even try, whether it's even worth it. And so those are basically, that's the kind of premise of the three stories and how the novels got started. And then, I know you'll ask me about this later, but the game aspect sort of was a happy accident almost with people that I knew that were connected to those first couple of books that did blurbs for me and so on. But yeah, that's what the books are about. And they came out, the first one was a long and winding road, but the edition that people now know came out in 2022, and Renegade was 2023, and Heretic just came out about 2 months and a couple of weeks ago. So that's the Gray Assassin Trilogy. So I'm happy with how it came out. And it was from Athos Arts, which did wonderful covers for them. And so very pleased ultimately with how the books came out and how they've been received so far.
That's fantastic. I'm going to jump ahead. I want to hear how that's making the jump to tabletop role-playing, but I want to jump ahead a little bit because you said something that treats something in my world-building brain is often as a DM or as somebody who's designing games professionally or homebrew, finding a way to take a theme like you were discussing there with faith and making that become part of the world, both through the lore and the world building, but also through mechanics quite often. How was that a consideration for you? Well, I'm jumping all over the place. We'll go back eventually here, but
it's all good.
I need to know.
So as far as the thematic thing, so first of all, I'll say, I talk about this a lot when I do workshops on this. I think theme is one of the biggest underreported or under sort of sold aspects of a lot of work. I think people sort of hear it and they immediately think of like polemic, like this has got to be like Upton Sinclair telling people, workers are not being treated well and whatever. And first of all, I think there's some value in polemic here and there, but more importantly, it's not really polemic, right? Theme is the thing that ties a lot of this stuff together. It's the reason that a book has weight anyway. You can tell, and I've read, and I'm sure you have too, things that there's nothing, in papers I call these the hermetically sealed essay, where there's nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't do anything. Like, it's there and you're like, I read that. And, it's like eating, middling vanilla ice cream. Like, it's fine. It doesn't hurt. Like I could have punched myself in the face, but this is better than doing that. But it's not interesting really, right? It's not engaging or interesting. And theme, I think, is the thing that elevates something above the level of just competency into something which is actually going to leave a lasting impact. Brandon O'Brien, who is a friend of mine and is also the game designer, also of Greyshade, the tabletop game, Brandon talked a lot about being really affected by the novel Greyshade because of this focus on faith and redemption. And is it possible to have a man's faith collapse the way that it does for Greyshade, where everything he believed he was doing was not being done for the reasons that he thought? What happens in that scenario? Like, does the person just die? Do they despair? Do they abandon hope? Do they become shells of themselves? Or do they find another way forward that doesn't require them to fall back on that old habitual kind of dogma? And that is one of the things that I think that theme is what sort of ties that book together. So in the same way, I think those are some of the things that get discussed in the tabletop game. And it's something which turns the game, I hope, from just, I'm playing this because it's fun, which is really important. Don't get me wrong. Like, that obviously has to be there, but turns it into something where people they feel like they've had an experience when they've played it. So there's an actual mechanic in the game, which is called faith. And the amount of faith that you possess, both positive and negative. You can have negative faith in the game, and negative doesn't mean bad. It means that you have a lack of faith, which may provide you advantages in certain ways and with certain groups, and disadvantages in other ways. And it's partially dependent on the class that you're playing. So if you have negative faith as an investigator, for example, it means you have grown particularly sort of cynical and kind of world weary, and you're sort of burned out on, you're a cop who's seen too much type of thing, right? And you then have these issues with the system. That means that the system is not going to be as likely to help you. Your superiors are going to be displeased with you maybe. You're not going to be as able to get sort of resources from the city in the same way that you might hope. But it also means that you'll have a better chance of going into some sort of the seedy underworld places and to be able to connect with those people and get information from them, because you're not obviously one of the fuzz, you're not obviously one of the sort of the kind of enforcing class that they have been taught to avoid. And so that kind of dynamic of how much faith you do or don't possess is something which is sort of interwoven into the game. And as I say, faith means different things for different people. So it's not the standard you are a Christian or not. Like, it's not about that. It's about the particular nature of how much you believe in the system that you've been trained in to begin with, whether that's being an acolyte, one of the assassin types, or whether it's being an investigator, or whether it's being an informant, who's one of the people that sort of an information broker that gathers information. That's all affected by faith as well. So that's it's a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but the answer idea is to sort of suggest that faith is a major thematic component of the books, and it's tied together as a thematic component of the game, which I think turns it from just a cool, fun game to play into something that I hope people will think about and remember once the game's over. At least that's the hope.
Brilliant. That's an excellent example of a mechanic that helps bring a theme through into a game. Like, that's fantastic.
Yeah, theoretically, that's what we hope.
I'm sure there was lots of play testing and tweaking and all the way.
There has been a good deal of play testing and tweaking, yes. Although we're looking forward to, once the thing actually gets released, the number of people that can test it grows exponentially, right? So you have a lot more people that are sort of going to feed back to us. But yes, the response that we've gotten so far has been very solid. And Brandon O'Brien, who is a wonderful poet and so on, is also a wonderful game designer. And the work that he's done on producing something which really captures the spirit of what I was trying to do in the novels, that's been amazing to watch. I am excited to play a game with him GMing, of this, and I'm excited to get a chance to sort of walk around my world in a different way, I guess, and watch other people invest themselves in that world. So very, very excited about that.
That is so cool that you're going to get a chance to actually explore, because normally a creator doesn't get to explore the world like that usually, because you're usually God. So you're going to get a chance to walk in it.
I cannot wait to. And I hope that people who are watching it, I'm going to run this a little bit on my Twitch channel. I'm hoping that we'll also give people a chance to see what it's like for people who know the world really well, like me, but also a couple of other players that will be playing with us who don't know the world as well. Like, they might have read the books once, but they're not, obviously living and breathing and sleeping it the way I was for many, many years. That won't be the case for them. So I also hope that'll be interesting to people to see how that dynamic works between players with more and less knowledge. So
cool. We'll drop links to the Twitch channel down below so we can all watch it happen.
Yes, I'm excited. That'll probably be getting started in a couple of months. It might start early 2025, but it will be in the next few months that we'll get underway.
Nice. Okay, well, let's back up before we get too far ahead of ourselves here.
Okay.
Obviously, the books are being turned into a tabletop role-playing game. How did that happen? You mentioned you stumbled into it and got lucky, or fortune play a part in it. What's the story there?
Yeah, so there were two things that happened. One, I did work with Alligator Alley Entertainment, which they've released a few games. They released a game called Espergenesis, which is a 5th edition compatible sort of a space opera game. And so if you think of a game like Stars Without Number or things in that area, that's what Espergenesis is about. And I ran a campaign, which was the flagship actual play campaign for them, which ran for a few years and was, that was a lot of fun. It was quite successful. And so I had a chance to work with them on that, and also then got a chance to speak to them about a couple of other projects that I was interested in. And one of them was this series of adventures that I ran at the Gen Con Writers Symposium, which was based on this adventure I'd written called Night at the Forbidden Library. And there were 3 in that original trilogy. I have since done another 3. And they said, well, if it's a library, we would love to publish the adventure, but also, would you be interested in having book supplements, like books that you would find in a library that people could drop into their campaigns? And I was like, yeah, it sounds amazing. And so we had a bunch of people from Ed Greenwood and Will Sobel and just a whole host of other people that wrote work for this, Ken Haidt and a bunch of other folks that wrote supplements, like little book things, book descriptions, which was really, really cool. And so that came out, I guess, 2019, 2020, something like that, and was very successful and has sold quite well. And I'm talking to them about the possibility of maybe doing a sequel to that. But that went very well. And so once that came out, it was a logical next step to say, hey, we have this possibility of this world that's coming out, and I have this idea maybe for a game and a person to develop it and design it. And is that something you might be interested in? And so they said yes. And so now they are the ones who are producing it. So Athos Arts has done that trilogy of books, and Alligator Alley is doing the game design aspect of this with they're producing the game. And Brandon O'Brien, I had already been friends with and connected with some time ago, but Brandon he was one of the people that we approached for a blurb on Greyshade, and he really loved Greyshade. As I said, it really was, meaningful to him personally. So his stuff was so interesting. I was like, I'd seen some of his other game design work, and I know that he's a good role player because I've had him play in a campaign of mine for a long time. And I said, are you interested possibly in doing some game design for this and actually doing this work? And he said yes. And so since then, we've been working on getting this done. And it's taken a little longer than we hoped initially, because we're doing this kind of from whole cloth, But it is now approaching the finish line. And as I say, he's done wonderful work. The adventure, the sort of sample adventure, which is designed to take people up, I think, through 3 levels, is really interesting with a lot of mystery and intrigue. And it introduces people to the world, and it also gives them a sense of what it means to play different classes and all that. It's really awesome. So yeah, it just came together with a guy who liked my work and I already knew, and was also a game designer, along with a company that I already did work with. And they, so these things, it tends to work that way. I honestly find if you cast your net wide enough and you have a large enough circle of people, there are people who want to work with you on various endeavors. And that's kind of what happened with this. So again, I got very lucky there.
Very cool. You mentioned working from whole cloth. That leads me into a question. What is the system? Like, are you building something from scratch, or is it D&D hack, or?
It's a combination. So it's a 5th edition compatible system. So it does use some of the same basic statistics, charisma, intelligence, wisdom, strength, and so on. It uses those. It's still using, it's a D20 based system. But we are adding different mechanics on a couple of levels. So first of all, I already mentioned that faith mechanic. That's a different element. Secondly, there is a resource which is basically named something different for each class, but it's essentially a series of points that you're able to use on various things to activate various abilities that you possess. So we have in here the investigator, we have the informant, we have the acolyte, we have the merchant, and we have a noble. And all 5 of those classes have certain resource points associated with them, which you can use to get different things. So for example, a merchant can use one of the merchant points, I believe we have them called, although that's gone through some different name changes, but basically that's the idea, that can use different weapons at a certain level and just can have them. They just have these weapons on them because they're merchants and they have access to this. But because they're not trained in their use, those weapons are subject to possible breaking. And so they use them, and after a round or 2 rounds or something like that, they can break. On the other hand, it means they're never likely to be completely disarmed, right? They're never likely to have. So we have that. We have combat arts that are specific to some of the classes, like the noble, for example. The noble has specific combat arts that allow them to be trained in flourishes and particular kinds of combat methods. So the sort of skeleton underneath it is 5e, and a lot of the things will be familiar to folks who are familiar with a D20 system. But the mechanics that are on top of it, like the faith, like the merchant points, like the combat arts and things like that, those are, we hope, really thematic and take this from a game that's just it's not an Assassin's Creed D&D reskin, right? It's something which is invested in a different approach to the way we think about gaming. It's very influenced also by Blades in the Dark, John Harper's game, which is something that Brandon in particular is a huge fan of Blades in the Dark. So it's also got that as an inspiration. So it's 5e skeleton, but there are a lot of new mechanics and things like that, as I mentioned, that are on top of it. Plus, also one last thing I should mention, sound shifting is the magic system within the books, kind of a subtle use of sonic magic, things like knocking on a wall behind you to create that effect of someone knocking behind a guard who's 100 feet down a hallway, things like that. That's something which is quite used quite often in the books. And so there are different sound shifting techniques that are available within the game as well, which different classes have access to at different levels. So I think it's got a very strong Greyshade flavor, but it will not be totally unfamiliar to folks who have played either Blades in the Dark or D&D 5th edition at some level before.
Cool. It's so obvious that you are passionate about this project. Like, it just comes across. And I'm going off script here, what drives, like, what drove you to do this? Like, obviously things lined up and you happen to know the right people and be at the right place, but to do all that work and have this much passion, what drives you to make that world into a game?
I love investing in worlds in different ways. I love, obviously, writing the books and having people feel immersed in that work. But I also love people being able to work through a world in a game context. That's a very special experience for me, getting the opportunity to see people look at the world and kind of live and breathe it, I suppose, in a different fashion than just playing it. Ideally, like the dream here would be for people to be able to watch like some sort of media, like film or television version of this, and maybe do like a computer game version of this. Like, I'd love people to be able to access it in different ways. mostly just because I think it's a pretty rich world. And thematically, I think it's an engaging world, and it's exciting to have people, invested in it sort of in different fashions. And my experience has been that when people get into it in one way, they end up coming to it in another way. So good friend of mine who's also an audiobook narrator that does most of the audiobooks for Battletech and Shadowrun did the audiobook for Greyshade. And he's wonderful, narrator, and did a wonderful job with it. And I just, I remember hearing the opening sequence. The opening sentence of the book is, "It's amazing how long it takes someone to die." And his reading of that and his reading of the prayer of repayment, which is what Greyshade does after he eliminates one of his targets, just gave me chills. And it was another way of accessing this particular world in a different fashion. So that, I think, is what it is. I really become interested in the way that we tell stories in all kinds of different mediums. And even though I am myself an author, and that's sort of one of the primary things I do, I am also a game player and a game master, and I'm fascinated by how people still tell stories in that world also. And so I think that's where the passion comes from. I love people being able to connect to my work in different ways. And so, yeah, and I'm excited to see the stories that they tell in that world that I wouldn't have thought of, and I get to see that they have then invested themselves in living in it too. And that's exciting for me.
It must be just electric seeing other people explore the world you've created and then start adding to it and making their own stories.
Absolutely, yeah. And being able to actually, I've had this experience with Brandon, just talking with Brandon, just talking shop with him about some things that I did. I started working with him on this back when I was still in the midst of Renegade. And so as I was writing the third and final book, Heretic, there were definitely elements of our conversations that we had about the Greyshade game that absolutely influenced aspects of what I was writing in Heretic, because it just was stuff that was giving me, and it was all coming from stuff that I had originally conceived of, but some of the sort of conclusions that he drew, I was like, that's awesome. Yes, absolutely. That's something that I need to think of in the way that this was approached. And so it really enriched the world, and writing is often a very lonely, sort of solitary activity. Having the chance to have someone that I was able to bounce ideas off of was really interesting, not just in an editing context, but in a game context. And I've been GMing for 40 years. I've been GMing for a long time, 38, 39 years anyway. And so it speaks to me on another level beyond just the writing level. So yeah, it's absolutely wild to watch people do that, and very inspiring, because it shows that they've obviously bought into the world, right? If they are so invested that they can come up with these different approaches to it and envision it in a way that I might not have thought of, but which is very much in the spirit of that world. I love that stuff. Yeah, I could watch that be done all day. I love that.
You mentioned you guys are doing a live play on Twitch. Is there anybody else lining up to maybe take this and do something?
We don't know yet, because until the game is officially released, right now it's just been in beta, and obviously our Kickstarter backers, have been looking at it and so on. Once that happens, though, I would, of course, adore having more people do this. I know a number of people have run my Tales and Tomes from the Forbidden Library adventure, which is, I love to hear those stories. I love. I know a number of people have talked to me about Greyshade and about the experience of reading the book and about what it means to them, and that's obviously amazing for any author. But as people get access to this and then begin to play their own campaigns or adventures, yeah, I ran into a guy who had done a map for my Tales and Tomes after it was published, and he did this full-out diorama with cotton for fog and all of this cool stuff. And I was just like, man, this is amazing. And he never reached out to me or anything. He had just done this and put it on Reddit as some. So I was like, this is awesome. Where did you? And he's like, oh man, I never thought I'd actually hear from the author, and this is great and whatever. I love that stuff. So yeah, I when Greyshade is officially released and it's available to a large pool of people, yeah, I cannot wait to hear and see what people do with it and play with it, of course. And also, not for nothing, I wouldn't mind having, sequels and supplements that we can do for this game too. So that would be nice. And that's more likely if more people are playing it. So yeah, we definitely want to do a full court press on it when it comes out, because I'm proud of the work. And I think if people are looking for a Blades in the Dark 5th edition combination with its own twist on things like faith and sound shifting and things like that, then that's what this is. And I'm hoping it's going to reach that larger audience as a result. So yeah, I'm psyched for it whenever it happens.
So cool. So cool. Give me chills, man. So what were some of the challenges? We talk about all the cool things.
Yeah.
But taking a novel to tabletop, what were some of the challenges you ran into that you weren't expecting?
Ooh. Well, I mean, so there were a couple things. I mean, one thing is you cannot communicate all of the stuff you're putting across in an, if each novel averages around 80,000 words, 80 to 85,000 words, you're talking about almost 250,000 words of text. It's very hard to communicate that in a much shorter role-playing supplement, right? Like I can't produce a fourth book that basically summarizes all three books. So figuring out the stuff that people need to get the feel of the world and what motivates the world thematically without just retelling the story, that was definitely a challenge for me. And fortunately, Brandon was great at being able to sort of cut to this sort of center of what game-wise matters about this world and what people are going to be invested in. But that was something for me that I was not sure how much of it to do, because like I say, I've played tabletop games for many decades, but I have not myself. I've written an adventure within a system, but I have never written a new system. I've never actually written something that was new, that had these new things. Even the faith mechanic, I worked out with Brandon, and I was nervous about how that was going to play out because it was not something that I was super familiar with before conceptually. And so that was difficult because like I say, I've played lots of different systems and so on, but building one myself and making sure that it's not hopelessly imbalanced or, sounds good in my head, but terrible at the table, that was definitely a challenge. And I relied heavily on Brandon, who actually has the kind of game design sense to know what things will work and what won't work. That was important. So that's one thing. And then I think the second thing was just what elements of the world to put together, what elements of the world are most important to convey. What portions of it, what things do we need more examples of, and what do we need fewer examples of? If you tell people 15th century Renaissance Venice, and we give a shadowy alleyways and roads and back doors to buildings with underground basements and passages, that starts to shape, I think, a little bit of what people imagine from the world. But figuring out exactly how much of that they need, how many sample NPCs, how many, sample buildings, how many adventure hooks they need, like how much of all of those things to do, that was definitely a challenge because of figuring out how long we wanted this thing to be in the first place. So that was because, when I'm writing a book, I'm writing the book till it's done. Like I have an outline, I know what it's supposed to go to. Then I work with the editor about how much should I cut or whatever, but I know sort of in my head how far it's supposed to go. But a game is largely dependent on the people who play it. And so figuring out how to give people just enough so they have enough that they can play it without overwhelming them, but also without giving them something that isn't enough meat on the bone. Figuring out that dynamic was definitely a challenge, which I think we've met, but that was some of the stuff that took the longest to get right.
I've had conversations before with guys like Matt Forbick comes to mind about balancing, leaving enough space for the players to make their own narrative and claim a chunk of the world versus making sure that theme you talk about is represented and the lore that you want to make sure is there. So was that something you had to balance and juggle and play with? Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally. And that idea of leaving enough space for the gamer. In novels, we talk about that I think about it as leaving the reader a little bit of work to do so that you're providing them some space for their own imaginative capacity. That's even more true in games, because you really have to give them something which will not prescribe to them, play this, but will allow them to feel like you're playing a choice of these things, you're making your own story. But there is a large kind of, there's a bubble, there's a space within which you're going to function, and going outside of that space probably wouldn't thematically feel right to the player. But at the same time, we don't want to limit that so much so that they feel they're just being kind of almost by the rules railroaded into a particular thing. So they sit down and they know we're going to get a thing about intrigue and about political machinations and about investigations in a dark city. And, those are all things that they can kind of get thematically. But it's not they're going to play Greyshade going through Corel because I already wrote that, and they can write that, they can read that for themselves. But I want them to be able to produce their own stories and their own adventures and to go their own way within that larger parameter. So yeah, leaving them work to do is important. And, and I know Matt quite well. And obviously Matt is both as sort of a more traditional author and as someone who's done a lot of game stuff, has had to navigate that stuff, quite a bit. So yeah, that dance about how much and how little to provide so that we can have that balance for players has been important.
When you have a heavy theme like you do, like a strong theme, which is it's so important for a good hook, is it hard to leave space? Say a group of players wants to explore a political theme. They want to take, and is there space there to go that route as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the things that's important is that, and this is one of the reasons why that faith thing is so broadly defined, because I can imagine very much people wanting to do a very noir-esque, investigation of murders. In fact, the adventure that we use in the book is itself a murder mystery. And so I can imagine them wanting to go that route. I can also imagine them wanting to be more invested in like how to be economically successful as a merchant in a city in which who you know and which information you gain from people is sort of your most valuable resource. I could see people going down that route. I could see people, again, looking for kind of and again, I mean this in the broadest possible sense, a religious exploration of what it means to, as they see it, serve a god. Can those gods shift or change? Being an informant, like, analyzing sort of what are my ethical limits? Do I want to just provide, information to the highest bidder? Or is there a point where I realize that the information that I provide is going to have profound effects on everybody else? And it's not just a commodity, like it's a choice. It's an ethical decision that I make about what information I give to whom. Those are all totally good by me. So yes, I want people to feel comfortable to do whatever sorts of things they feel are within that sort of larger context. They may even want to be able to. I mean, the first book that we're doing, or the first part of the role-playing game, focuses kind of on city play. But down the line, we have thoughts about doing stuff that allows for more overland play, leaving the city, just as the books do. Greyshade leaves the city and has to go cross-country, and that's a very different use of skill set than what he got used to with small alleyways and kind of back rooms and things like that. This is very different. So I want people to have the opportunity to do that too. So yes, I want to give them space to be able to explore it. It's not, heroic fantasy per se. So it's not, we're going to go slay dragons, right? It's not one of those things. I'd say it's a fairly low magic environment, but it is a magic environment. It is fantasy, and it's not intended to be dreary and like, everyone sucks and, Game of Thrones in Venice. Like it's not meant to be that either. It's meant to be something where there's a grace note of hope there, that you're trying to do the best you can in a world that is confusing and difficult and dark. And people can make profound effects in that world in many different ways. And that's what I want to give people the opportunity to do in the game.
So cool. That is so cool, man.
Thank you. I hope everyone else sees that too.
I could keep chewing about the craft stuff all day, but we're going to run out of time eventually. So I'm curious, part of the process is publishing. There was crowdfunding involved. There was a business side to this. How involved were you with that? Was there challenges there that you learned from?
Yeah, for sure. I've been involved with several Kickstarters and crowdfunding, and we kickstarted basically the first novel was already more or less going to be out, but we kickstarted the trilogy as a whole, and we included the game as a part of that. There's a board game concept which I've also put out there that exists and may be able to follow up on depending on the success of these. But we ended up just limiting the Kickstarter to game and books. That was a bit of a challenge because our original thought was that it was going to combine audiences together, and that people who came to Athos Arts for their publishing and people who came to Alligator Alley for their game publishing would sort of both be brought into this. In practice, I'm not sure that it was as unifying as I thought it would be. I think in the end, there were people who bought into the Kickstarter for the books, and there were people who bought into the Kickstarter for the game, and I'm not sure there was as much crossover as I was hoping for. Part of that may be that it's not an established property, right? At that point, nobody knows that much about the Gray Assassin Trilogy. If I'm doing the same thing and it's, the Star Wars or something like that, it's pretty easy for people to be able to know that there's books and there's games and there's TV and there's movies and whatever. But with me, with this work, it hadn't yet made a sort of profound effect on the market. And so that world didn't exist as a clear concept in people's minds yet. So that was definitely a challenge. And So figuring out how to bring those people together was helpful. We did fund in the end, but it was, whereas, say, Tales and Tomes funded quickly and easily and ended up getting like 200% of its goal, this just funded, and it funded pretty late. And again, I think that was a combination of a number of factors. It still did well enough that it did fund, and it is, going to be out there, and I'm the books themselves have done quite well and so forth. So like it did what we needed it to do, but the heavy lifting we had to do on the crowdfunding campaign was more than I expected initially. And I think if I had to do it again, I probably would have split them off. I would have recommended that we had each company do things differently. But I don't know. I was thinking of it as funding an IP as a whole, and the IP, I think, just needs to be better known for that to be successful in the way that one hoped. But we did do the heavy lifting, and we were able to get it over the line in a successful way. So in the end, it worked out, but definitely with a little more agita than I had hoped for originally.
Well, you learned from it, and
yes, I
share that wisdom with us.
I learned don't do that thing again, at least not that specific thing. Yeah, it worked out, but...
Yeah, you crossed the finish line. That's all that matters, man.
Right. Totally.
100%. Okay, well, let's kind of bring this part of the conversation kind of to an end here.
Okay.
I guess a big picture, let's bring it all together. How has your gaming life, tabletop role-playing, playing it, designing it, how does that influence your writing over the years and vice versa? What are the common threads there?
Yeah, I've talked about this actually in workshops that I've run about this profoundly in both directions. On the writing side, what writing has done for me as a game master is it's taught me the importance of theme in my work. That was something I've talked about before. Sort of thematic considerations in gaming, I think, is a way to give people a sense of structure, like the stakes of an adventure, without limiting too much what they do, right? They understand what the stakes are. And once they understand what the stakes are, they can then proceed accordingly, recognizing that here's the stakes, though, like here's the things you need to keep in mind. So it's done that. And it's also meant, from the writing point of view to the game mastering side, writing has also allowed me to understand something about discipline, about preparation, about how you prepare for a game. I think it's quite possible to over-prepare for gaming. I think it's possible to over-structure and over-limit, and making it so that, again, the dreaded, you're railroading people through an adventure rather than giving them parameters, but then allowing them to work within those parameters however they want to. So writing has given me the discipline I need to make sure it doesn't go way off the rails. But the other side of it, the game mastering, has taught me not to limit too much. And on the other direction, game mastering to writing, I mean, so many things. I think my ability to write action sequences and scenes. Paul Weimer from Skiffy and Fanty and also Nerds of a Feather is a now multiple Hugo winner, actually. Paul was kind enough to review Heretic and the trilogy as a whole. And Paul said in that the action beats really sang, that it was those moments where he felt like he really liked the works, and he gave a very positive review, but he said these were among the strongest parts were these action beats and the sort of being able to visualize what's happening in the action scenes. And that's directly out of my game mastering, like being able to paint for players what's happening in an action sequence, even if you're not doing just theater of the mind, right? And you're just doing people moving around a map. Even then, it's a lot different to show tokens or miniatures moving and then to actually look like what that means on the ground. Where's the sword swipe coming? How is the person being hit? What it means when they just avoid being killed by a shot. Like in hit points, you go down to a hit point, but what does that mean in terms of the spear just sort of gives you a flesh wound or it misses you? Like, what does that all mean? So that ability to understand action comes to completely from game mastering. And also, I think it's also made my writing more dynamic, being able to describe things in a way that people themselves feel as if they are present or invested in that stuff, whether it's action or whether it's sort of serious, psychological, quieter beats that are sort of not as whiz-bang, but are just as important in terms of how characters are developing and so on. That also is something that I've gained from game mastering. I think it's given my writing a much greater dynamism in life, for sure. So I have been nothing but helped by the combination of both of them, and I'm happy that I'm able to talk about that now more and not feel almost sort of embarrassed by it. Like, well, your writing should be its own separate thing, and it's nonsense. Like, your writing is influenced by everything you are, or it's no good. If your writing is not a product on some level of the things that you value, then it's never going to matter to anyone else if it doesn't really matter to you. So that's something that I've learned a great deal from tying together my game mastering experience and my writing experience together. So yeah, I'm grateful that I was able to combine them together in my work.
Wow, that's fantastic. The hits keep coming. I would love to just sit and talk about what you learn as a DM for describing combat. That is so cool. Like that's a whole nother episode.
Yeah, that stuff is, I will not send myself to a competitor podcast, but I will say that a friend of mine and I, Zach Clay, do a show where we talk about GMing and DMing tips. Where some of
you go ahead and plug it. Go right ahead.
I'll just say it's called Gen GMs from two separate generations of GMs. I'm obviously the younger one, clearly.
Clearly,
and so no, but he is a late 20s or mid to late 20s guy, player, GM, really wonderful guy, and very awesome dungeon master, does professional DMing work. So we talk a lot about this kind of stuff too, and it's like, yeah, I really enjoy that because I enjoy getting a chance to, like I've been enjoying this conversation with you. I like talking shop, so that's a lot of fun.
Oh, and yeah, no, I will throw the link to that show in the notes. Like, no,
thank you.
Rising tide raises all boats.
That's true for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, I guess I kind of choose up the main topic, but I do have a couple of questions I'd like to throw at you before we head out. We're going to start with the weird one, my philosophical question that lives at the center of this social experiment I call a podcast.
Okay.
And that question is, in my opinion, there exists a magical space at the intersection of obviously story and game, but improv, comic book writing, board game design, all of these things where we can all just hang out. There's a shared language. There's a fellowship that just happens.
Yep.
If you agree with me, and not everybody does, but if you do, what is the magical thread that holds that space together?
I do agree. So I think we are hardwired for story. I was on a panel at a convention maybe about 5 or 6 months ago that was arguing that it was based on an article that was arguing that storytelling is sort of a lie because it's fundamentally getting us to think about the world in a sort of fantastical way. And that sort of pulls us away. I'm paraphrasing, but it sort of pulls us away from the reality of what we're facing. And I could not disagree more with that premise. I think that we are hardwired for story, partly because we have been doing it for thousands of years. And so long before we could write anything or even speak, we were telling each other stories in caves about the hunting of various creatures and about we were reenacting things that happened to us. So that's part of it. I think we're dramatic creatures and storytelling creatures by nature. And so that's part of it. I also think that the storytelling aspect, you mentioned that it's a space where we can all hang out, and I agree. I think it also allows everyone to feel invested in that story and it's in their own way. Because as we said, you're leaving room for people, right, to do what they want to do, to feel like they're a part of what you're providing them. And so it becomes something where people then are invested in a story, and that allows them to exercise their own imaginative capacity. So when we teach children, for example, about things relating to how to structure their play, we don't have to teach them to actually do it. We don't have to teach them that it's cool to tell stories with each other. We don't have to teach them to make up stuff for their stuffed animals to do with each other, like my son, my 8-year-old, does all the time. Or, we don't have to teach them to do that. They are already engaged in wanting to do it at some level. What we need to do is not try to drain it out of them by having them focus on, more serious affairs in quotes, right? Like making sure that, don't just, make sure you stay concentrated on the worksheets that we put in front of you, right? Like that stuff is there is a time and a place for the discipline of certain kinds of learning that requires you to focus on doing math problems or whatever the case may be. There's a time and place for that. But what really keeps us invested and engaged in the world around us, I would argue, is telling stories to and with each other. And we do that through games, and we do it through the retelling of, sharing the experience of watching live theater or watching movie or, film or television shows with each other and talking about it. And even fan fiction, right, that is doing different things with those characters is a form of that same creativity. We do it through writing. We do it through art, visual art. We do it through dance. We tell story in all sorts of different ways. Songwriting, we do stories in all sorts of different ways. And so I think broadening how we envision story being presented, whether it's in gaming or in writing or in music or in anything else, that is very important for us. And we need to continually tell each other the stories of who we are as individuals and as members of a community and members of a family. And if you can do all of that, then you advance all of us, I think, as a species. I don't want to be overdramatic, but I think that's how it works. All of us are better when we tell a narrative about something. I heard this, I'll just tell this quickly. They've done studies that demonstrate that people who go through certain kinds of trauma, that people who go through the worst kinds of trauma, parents being killed and orphans of war and so forth, what they find when they follow these people for some time afterwards, after that experience, is that the ones who are the most successful, in fact, so successful that the trauma does not permanently destroy them, are the ones who are able to create a narrative about what happened to them, that can create a story that makes sense about why they went through the trauma they did. And it is not the level of the trauma that determines potential damage. It's their ability to build a narrative, a coherent narrative that makes sense to them about what happened, that determines whether or not it will haunt them or whether they can move beyond it. And I found that fascinating, and it's an example of what I think the power of what story can do. So at that intersection, you talked about games, movies, film, television. At the heart of those, I think, is storytelling and what we do with narrative and constructing narratives individually and how we share those stories with each other, I think. So I agree with you.
That's some pretty powerful shit, man.
Well, thanks. But it's a good question because I do think that there's an intersection there for sure.
Have you read The Storytelling Animal, like explored the evolutionary use of story?
I have no, and it's a gap that I need to fill. I've heard a lot of things about that, but I haven't done it yet. No, I have to.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
It sounds like you have. Like a lot of the things you're saying are, it's there. So
that's cool. Yeah, no, I do want to read it because I've gotten more and more interested in this as I've gotten older, just because I see so many intersections with, the classes I teach with my students, with everything I do seems to come back to questions about how we tell stories to each other. And it's not just to make up stuff. It's because it really is about reinventing who we are and sharing who we are with others. So,
and like you said, it's often used as a tool for framing, for taking a trauma and turning it into a strength.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's one reason why I think it's important to be able to show sort of fictional versions of those narratives and also to tell realistic versions. I think this is why narrative nonfiction is popular, because people do want to read about things that actually happened, but they like to read them in a way where they feel dynamically invested in what's happening. And the better that someone is able to do that in a sort of more popular form of nonfiction work, the more likely they are to be successful in conveying that. And that is not lying. That's not bringing us away from the reality. I would argue that it's investing us in the reality because we experience reality in a story-based way. We are the heroes or sometimes the villains of our own stories, and people around us become a part of that in a very powerful method and fashion.
Big agree. I agree. All right. Before we head out for the door here, I do like to do a little quick fire just to get to know you a little bit better.
Okay.
What are you reading these days?
I am reading a book by my friend Valerie Valdez called Chilling Effect, which I highly recommend. It's the first book in that series. Highly recommended. Valerie is a good role player as well, but also a good author. And so I've been enjoying that quite a bit. I was over the summer, Paul actually compared aspects of my work to The Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny. And one of the gaps in my reading was I hadn't read The Nine Princes of Amber, and I have now. So I've read that because I was really excited to do that. And then otherwise at the moment, because I'm in the middle of my semester, I am reading the stuff I teach. So I'm teaching Lord of the Rings and I am teaching science fiction. So I always have to reread the stuff that I'm teaching. So Frankenstein, Time Machine, I'm going to be doing This Is How You Lose the Time War by Mel Elmatar and Martha Wells, All Systems Red, the Murderbot stuff. So those are things that I do every semester as I teach these things. But in terms of my own pleasure reading right now, it is Valerie's book, which is quite good. I recommend it.
Nice. What are you playing these days?
So on the tabletop front, I am running multiple campaigns. I'm running an Eberron campaign, long running, including someone, Jennifer Brozek, who is how I got connected to you. So I'm doing that. I have been running an Expedition from the Mysterious Peaks, which is an adventure campaign from Alligator Alley that I mentioned before. I'm running a Beowulf campaign, which is just a duet system. So it's just the GM and a player. And I am running a more standard D&D Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which is a Greyhawk campaign as well. So that's what I'm playing. On the video game side at the moment, I'm doing a retro kick. So on my Twitch channel, I'm playing Forgotten Realms Unlimited Adventures, which is an old gold box game from 92. And that's been a blast. So those are the things that I am playing right now, video game and format wise. Oh, and I'm also playing Mario Kart 8 with my 8-year-old, but I'm not sure that counts.
It definitely counts.
There's a whole story about Mario. No.
Well, I want to hear the story, but next time.
No, I'm kind of making that up. No, there are limits.
All right. Last quick fire. This one's kind of tough.
Okay.
If your essence was perfectly distilled down and then injected into a game, it could be tabletop, board game, video game, what game, what world, and what race, class, stereotype would you be?
Oh, good Lord. Okay, I'll give you 2 answers to that. 3 answers, actually. This which is probably cheating. Video game front, it would be as an adventurer exploring Ultima Underworld. That's an old style game that people may remember from the early 90s. About a person walking through this underground complex of multiple levels with multiple different races of creatures that you have to kind of get to know and understand. That would sort of, that character would be me a little bit. In terms of tabletop, I would say the Talisman board game, because that game, which is originally from, well, went through a number of iterations, but initially Games Workshop, where you wander around this realm and explore a bunch of different places and have stories with a bunch of different creatures. That also sort of fits, who I am, depending on what it is. And as far as like TTRPG type stuff, I would say probably Dungeons and Dragons, and I would be a ranger. My favorite character in Lord of the Rings was always Aragorn, who I felt like had sort of depth and complexity to him, and sort of for a long time was in the shadows, kind of helping when he could and doing what he could without sort of revealing himself. And then at a certain stage kind of does have to reveal himself and sort of claim whatever birthright that he possesses. And I don't want to be grandiose about it, but I like the idea of being someone who can come out of the shadows and kind of reveal a bit of what I've been working on for some time. So also he's a badass. So there's also that. So if I could be imagined as a badass, I don't know if I get to do that, but if I could, like, sign me up for Aragorn.
Excellent answer. Okay, well, we're going to start heading for the door here, but I do like to open up a little space. Is there anything you want to boost or promote? You've touched on a couple things, but throw it all together for us. And where can people find you online?
Sure. Well, so my website is gregoryawilson.com. I also have a website that's devoted to my kind of gaming and streaming pursuits, and that's arvaneleron.com, ARVANELERON.com. That's a character from my first novel. And as far as Twitch is concerned, my Twitch channel is twitch.tv/ArvanEleron. And I've been streaming for 12 years now, I believe, and doing a bunch of stuff with people online and elsewhere. I'd say the thing that I'm sort of getting everyone ready to boost right now is Greyshade. There's going to be a promotion going on very soon that I can't talk about very much, but it's going to be happening in the next, as we record this, less than a week from now, there's going to be a pretty big Greyshade promotion. So I would definitely urge people to check out the Gray Assassin Trilogy. And while you're there, if you go to Athos Arts, ATTHISARTS.com, if you go to Athos Arts and find Greyshade, there's also a place there where you can pre-order the tabletop role-playing game, and you can find out about that, which is coming out late this year, early 2025. And so I would encourage people to check out those things in particular. So please stop by my Twitch channel. Would love to speak to anyone who found me through this podcast. And otherwise, Gerald, thank you for conducting this. I really appreciate the time, and I enjoyed the conversation.
This has been a blast, buddy. We're going to head out the door. That's it. But I do want to give you the last word. Do you have any parting words for wisdom while I kick you out into the cold?
Continue to find and tell stories. My 3 C's are community, compassion, and communication. And I think if you can put those 3 C's together in producing the stories that you tell, whether they're in the games you play or the books that you write or the dances that you do or the sculptures that you make or whatever, that's a good way for us all to become better human beings and to work with each other to be better human beings. So you do that through storytelling. So keep it up is what I would say.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. Apparently, somebody mistook one of the big kegs in the basement for a portal to another plane, so I'm going to have to go deal with that. But before you head out, I'd like to stop and say thank you to Gregory for sitting down and sharing what you've learned along the way. And to you, dear listener, as always, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, sharing, and exploring those worlds and stories. Stay safe, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the corner of Story and Game.